That's a beautiful beginning. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third Dean's Lecture for 2023. My name is Lindsay Oates. I'm one of the Deputy Deans of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and I also would like to recognise Professor Larissa McLean-Davies, who is with us tonight, who has a lot of expertise in this area that we're going to hear about in a moment. I would first like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri or Wurundjeri or Wurundjeri. I was just discussing these different pronunciations with Barry about the grub that eats the manna gum. So the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, I pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respects to other Indigenous Australians present. And I also acknowledge the role of Indigenous knowledge or knowledges in the Academy, of course, in this very important potential year of reconciliation. So on that note, really delighted to welcome our special guest speaker tonight, Professor Barry Judd. But before we do that, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to recognise some of the special guests we have with us tonight. Welcome to our Provost, Professor Nicola Phillips, and Steve, the partner, who is a Manchester United supporter, I just found out. Also, welcome Professor Field Rickards, Dean Emeritus of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Lovely to see you and welcome back. And also Professor Barry McGaw, welcome back here. Professor Jane Hanson, Jane Hanson, our Chancellor, isn't here, but hopefully she may appear soon. Also Paula Judd, welcome to join us. So now we come to the long introduction to Barry that he said he did not wish to hear, but I think it's important to put in context both all of the things that Barry has done and also to get a sense of the breadth of his contribution. So Professor Judd recently elevated from Pro Vice-Chancellor Indigenous to Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous. Since 2020, Professor Judd has served as the Director of Indigenous Studies, and since 2022, additionally undertaken the role of Pro Vice-Chancellor Indigenous. One of the most notable accomplishments in Professor Judd's role as Pro Vice-Chancellor Indigenous is his leadership in the development of the university's new Indigenous Strategy 2023 to 2027. The new strategy represents a big step forward for the university, progressing our institution, the University of Melbourne, beyond the Reconciliation Action Plan framework and committing us to 21 transformational projects, positioning the university both as a national and global leader in Indigenous higher education and research. And this strategy will be launched in July. And Professor Judd and I were just chatting about other initiatives, including global Indigenous programs, but more to come, and I don't want to steal anything you may have to say. So the recent promotion to Deputy Vice-Chancellor recognises Barry's significant work to date. So before we introduce Barry, let's please join me in congratulating Barry in his promotion to Deputy Vice-Chancellor. So in addition to this impressive influence at the university, Professor Judd has an extensive portfolio of achievements outside of the university. He has worked in support of Indigenous activity in Australian higher education for over 30 years in both professional staff and academic roles. He is a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and he was also a Foundation Chief Investigator of the National Indigenous Research and Knowledges Network, and a Foundation Editor of Aboriginal Journal of Indigenous Studies and First Nation and First Peoples Cultures. He's a current board member of the Museums and Galleries of the Northern Territory, the Life Again Foundation, and a member of the Reconciliation Action Plan, and part of the committee of the Richmond Football Club, which is probably one of my lesser favourite achievements of yours, but congratulations. He holds an MA in Public Policy and a PhD in Australian Indigenous Studies and postgrad quals in Higher Education and Teaching and Learning. His area of expertise relates to Australian race relations in Australian sports and interdisciplinary research methods in Indigenous studies and Australian history. His work is widely published, and like many of us, what we all strive for, he holds several current Australian Research Council research grants. So with that broad and comprehensive introduction, could you please join me in welcoming Barry to the stage to deliver his Dean's Lecture, Giving Voice to Indigenous Australia, Formal Education, Help or Hindrance. Please welcome.
Wow, who was he talking about? Pretty humbling and overwhelming, thank you. I'd like to start this lecture by acknowledging that we meet this evening on the unceded territory of the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and acknowledge the other Indigenous peoples on whose land we work and live throughout Australia. Such acknowledgements are important because they remind us of our place in the world and the country that continues to sustain us every single day. I also wish to acknowledge the Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, or is it the Faculty of Education? I haven't worked it out yet. Professor Jim Waterston, for his generous invitation to me to deliver this lecture in 2023. I also wish to thank the audience for turning out midwinter to come and listen to me. This year is a particularly important one for all Australians who are eligible to cast a vote. The coming referendum to determine whether there should be an Indigenous voice to Parliament has the potential to redefine how Australian democracy operates and improve it in ways that will reshape how we understand both the proper operations of national politics and ourselves and our national identity, culture and values. In the decade that followed Federation in 1901, Australian politics led the world in many areas of social policy, extending the rights of white women through the franchise and white men through a centralised arbitration system of wage setting. These are historic achievements of Australian democracy that continue to be worthy of commemorative celebration. And yet the Constitution that enabled these progressive steps forward to be achieved is an inherently flawed document. The Australian Constitution, adopted in 1901, deliberately excluded Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders from it, and therefore continues to exist as a dishonourable document. Racial exclusion continues to be the foundation on which contemporary Australian politics rests. It is a rotten foundation. It is my view that a successful referendum to recognise the place of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders in the Australian Constitution will transform the document to one that is honourable, just and fit for purpose. In 1967, a previous generation of Australian voters were able to recognise constitutional flaws that made Australia unequal in its treatment of citizens. Today, we and our generation have a great opportunity to vote yes to constitutional recognition and an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Political changes that have the great potential to not only recognise the rightful place of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australian society, but to reshape the society in ways that create a more just and a more equal Australia for the future. Our generation has a great opportunity to change the future for the better and improve the lives that our children and grandchildren will live and how they understand themselves in the world as Australians. I hope that that means a future Australia in which Indigenous people are viewed as equals, where their thoughts and opinions are taken seriously, where their religious practices and beliefs are protected by law, and where it becomes a viable and realistic aspiration for Indigenous children to aspire to positions of leadership, to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, deans, vice-chancellors, members of Parliament, CEOs of Australian global mining companies, yes, they exist, and Prime Ministers of Australia, and so on. I also hope that it is an Australian future where Indigenous children born today have opportunity to live lives that are meaningful, rich, productive, fun, and as long as those presently enjoyed by many non-Indigenous Australians. The great opportunity the forthcoming referendum offers us in changing the future of Australia also comes with great responsibility. Whether or not constitutional recognition of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders is achieved through the mechanism of an Indigenous voice to Parliament will be up to the Australian people to decide. Compulsory voting in Australia means that all eligible voters are required to make a decision about these questions. Many have complained about the inefficiency of democracies to deliver rational political outcomes for the betterment of society. And this is perhaps particularly true in respect to the most marginal and disadvantaged groups in society. And it is also particularly true of multicultural and multi-ethnic democratic states, as political philosophers John Rawls and Will Kimlicka note in their writings on the United States and Canada. Nevertheless, it is also true that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried, as Winston Churchill once famously said. In a democracy such as ours, we therefore must trust that those who will vote are well informed and have an adequate understanding of the issues that they are being asked to determine through the referendum process. This means that those who vote are assumed to possess adequate background knowledge about why this referendum question is being put to them, information that will enable them or enable each and every voter to make an informed decision about either voting yes or voting no. Such assumptions rely on a functional system of formal education that is well-rounded and supports a strong civics education agenda. I am here tonight to tell you that I have doubts that this is the case in present-day Australia. Late last year, I attended a University of Melbourne and City of Melbourne co-hosted event to celebrate the winners of the Sydney Peace Prize, Professor Megan Davis, Pat Anderson AO and Noel Pearson, celebrating and acknowledging their work to develop the Uluru Statement from the Heart. At this event, Professor Davis revealed some of her fears about the forthcoming referendum and its chances of success. Professor Davis suggested the possibility of failure because non-Indigenous Australians continue to see and view Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders as unknowns and alien to their own sense of national self and their everyday lives as Australians. These comments by Professor Davis reminded me of a book written years earlier by the influential Australian historian Henry Reynolds, in which he asks, "Why weren't we told?" Reynolds' book was a commentary on the lack of knowledge, insight and understanding the vast majority of Australians have about the history of past conflict in the frontier wars that took place between Aboriginal peoples defending their country and way of life against so-called settlers from the British Isles who invaded their homelands and took possession of their land by force. The comments of Davis reminded me that what Reynolds had said years before remained true. Australians overwhelmingly continue to not know Indigenous Australia and have little or no understanding of the history that sits behind the referendum question that they will be asked to determine later this year. My lecture this evening asks why this continues to be the case and what role formal education has played in making it so. To what extent has formal education in Australia helped give voice to Indigenous peoples by enabling non-Indigenous Australians to be told their own colonial histories in a way that allows them to start to know Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders? Now, at this point, I need to briefly outline the limitations of what I'm about to say. I need to tell you that I am not an educational specialist and that I spend little, or actually no time, thinking about the mechanics of teaching and learning or the theories about how to teach and learn in the most productive and impactful ways. My attempts to answer, or at least provide some insight to the questions of whether formal education in Australia can be a help or hindrance to the facilitation of an Indigenous voice, is based on my lived experience as an Australian who possesses an Aboriginal heritage as well as a British one and an Asian one, and who for the past 23 years has taught undergraduate students Indigenous studies within the Australian higher education sector. Although I see myself sitting outside expertise of education and of teaching and learning in terms of holding any particular expertise like that of this faculty and its staff, I do claim to know through personal experience something about Australia's formal education system and its role and relationship to Indigenous people's issues and agendas, as well as its effectiveness to teach and inform non-Indigenous Australians about the place, past and present, that Indigenous peoples hold in Australian society. This knowledge started many years ago when I attended primary school in the regional Victorian city of Ballarat. I attended primary school during the 1970s at a time when people in regional Victoria denied the existence of Aboriginal people in their towns and in their districts. Aboriginal people, so the story went, represented only a problem for white towns in Queensland, the Northern Territory and Western Australia. When I grew up, there were no Aborigines in Victoria. These widespread myths were held to be true in all sectors of settler society, including schools, and the teachers responsible for educating young Australians held them too. As a primary school student who was often walked to the school gate by my brown-skinned Aboriginal mother, racial vilification in the schoolyard was an everyday and unavoidable reality of my school day experience. Although unpleasant, I learned to live with being called an abo and being told I wasn't really an Australian and didn't belong. I now wonder how many friendships, social events and opportunities for academic advancement I was excluded from because of this kind of endemic racism. But at the time, such racism was considered such a normal part of school life that teachers and parents accepted it to the extent that it was never talked about or commented upon. Racial vilification of Indigenous people was part of national identity and a marker of Australianness. Yet what is most memorable from my primary school days is not the blatant racism experienced in the schoolyard. I feel like didn't tell Tim, but wait, there's more. It is the more subtle forms of racism, exclusion and marginalisation that I suffered at the hands of my teachers and the curriculum they imposed upon me. While there were many incidents, one in particular stands out as memorable. I was either in grade 3 or grade 4 and had started to learn about the history of Australia. I had previously just returned from a family holiday to Central Australia where I had visited with my Aboriginal grandmother and other members of my family at a place called Maryvale Station, now known as the Aboriginal community of Titjacala. My memories of this, my first visit to Central Australia, remain vivid. My grandmother and other Aboriginal people who lived at the station did so in very small fibro and tin houses. These houses did not have heating or cooling, and to me looked like the outbuildings of the farm my white grandfather had in central Western Victoria. This was a period in the immediate aftermath of the introduction of equal pay. The community at Maryvale existed to provide cheap labour to the pastoral industry, with Aboriginal people working as stockmen and household domestics for the white station people. By the time I visited as a primary school-age child, all the cattle work had evaporated. Men and women who had previously worked for a living were now relegated to the scrap heap of welfare dependency. I remember crossing the creek that separated black from white to the station homestead with my grandmother to collect a weekly handout of rations, tea, sugar, flour, a little meat and a little tobacco. I also remember a grandfather who had been head stockman crossing that same creek weekly to ask for work that no longer existed. These experiences must have been fresh in my mind when, during an Australian history lesson, I felt compelled to challenge my teacher and his assertion that Captain Cook had discovered Australia in the 18th century, and that this act of discovery was the start of everything in Australia. I raised my hand and outlined the reasons why this could not be true. I explained to my teacher and fellow students that I had just come back from the Northern Territory and that my family there had told me they'd been here since the beginning of time, long before whitefellas had arrived on their country. My teacher responded by ridiculing me and sending me to stand outside the classroom. In asking this question and providing a different perspective about the human origins of Australia, I had become a troublemaker and a nuisance to be disciplined appropriately. This experience became the defining moment in my formal education journey. I should have a drink now. It's pretty heavy stuff, isn't it? Although I remained engaged with education, I increasingly became a self-directed learner. After this learning experience, I became quiet in class. I only did what I had to do. I never asked questions. I tried to hide up the back of the room and lay as low as possible. I guess you'd say I became disengaged from formal education to some degree. Living in a working class household, reading materials were generally in short supply. I was therefore very grateful when my parents invested in a full set of World Book encyclopedias. This set of reference materials became the best teacher I would have for many years to come. Primary school had become a place where I had no voice, a place where no one believed me, a place where no one wanted to listen to what I had to say. I survived by becoming invisible to the system. The strategies for survival that I had learned at primary school enabled me to survive high school and to complete Year 12. This was something that no one had encouraged me to do. Teachers, as well as friends of the family, would often advise my parents about the difficulties I would face in attempting to complete a high school certificate. This was a task that most people believe would be beyond my intellectual capacities to successfully complete. When I did succeed in completing this task and commenced to study an undergraduate degree at Ballarat University College, some of my lecturers indicated the same doubts and were amazed that I had completed the degree program and had gone on to get a full-time job working at the University of Melbourne. I often now wonder to what extent this advice and these readings of my academic abilities had to do with me as an individual, or were they simply the result of racism and racist stereotypes about Aborigines and Aboriginal males in particular. The picture I am painting of my own experience of Australian formal education is a bleak one, and no doubt explains why in my late teens I found much solidarity in the music of Roger Waters and Pink Floyd. And yet, despite my bleak experience of formal education, the institutions of school and university continued to hold the promise of life-changing uplift and transformation through the gift of learning. Fortunately, there were those who saw me and who wanted to hear my voice and my point of view. In Year 12, I met an amazing teacher, Doug Bradbury, who taught 18th century history. I learned about the French Revolution and the development of modern European states. I was also introduced to the Enlightenment philosophies of Voltaire and Rousseau and how these had impacted the development of core French political values, liberty, equality, fraternity. Bradbury was able to connect with me and the other working class kids in my class because he believed in us and our abilities to learn, to succeed, and to go on to lead meaningful, productive and rich lives informed by learning and education. It was Bradbury who gave up his Sunday to drive me and the others in the class down to the University of Melbourne to attend a public lecture on French Enlightenment. This was also a pivotal moment in my educational journey, as before this experience I did not know that places like this university existed. It was Bradbury who gave me the confidence to go on to undergraduate level studies. I've never forgotten that aside from his staunch defence of political freedom, Voltaire also carried on an affair with his niece. At university, it was another rare teacher supportive of my progress, Dr. Janice Newton, who directed me into a career in Indigenous studies. Still lacking direction and not knowing what to do beyond my degree, Dr. Newton suggests I use the final year of my studies to explore my own identity by engaging with Australian history. Dr. Newton sent me the task of writing a 10,000-word paper on the implications of Henry Reynolds' histories of the frontier for Australian understandings of national self. This was an essay topic that set me on the path to becoming a Professor of Indigenous Studies, and I am grateful for her supportive interventions into my learning. Dr. Newton was also important to my education journey because she was the person who encouraged me to apply to an Aboriginal cadetship scheme offered by the University of Melbourne. With her encouragement, I applied and gained full-time employment at this university, an opportunity that enabled me to study after work in the evenings to complete a graduate diploma and a master's degree in public policy. I think it was in this building, I can't remember, but I think some of the classes were. My experience articulates just one view of Australian formal education, and as such, it does not necessarily speak to the experience of others. However, research by educational specialists does show that formal education experienced by Indigenous people in Australia remains less than ideal. For example, Dr. Beth Marsden, who recently completed her PhD under my supervision, found that during the 20th century, Victorian Aboriginal people experienced schooling in ways that were highly problematic. Although state education operated on the basis that race did not exist, Aboriginal people attending school throughout Victoria experienced racism as a key characteristic of their school experience. Marsden discovered that school teachers were deeply implicated in the propagation of the stolen generations, and that many Aboriginal parents were required to play an ongoing game of cat and mouse with the Education Department of Victoria, often crossing state borders to escape surveillance and the possibility that their children would be forcibly removed from their care. Similarly, PhD research by another past student, Dr. Al Fricker, suggested a primary school education offered to remote communities in Central Australia continues to be unfit for purpose. Embedded at the Papunya Primary School for the best part of one term, Dr. Fricker found it more likely that teachers would embed Maori concepts and terms into the curriculum than those drawn from the Lurija culture of the students attending the school. Dr. Fricker also confirmed the persistence of racism as a defining feature of Lurija experience of formal education. In one incident, a young student with mental health issues who had climbed onto the roof of the school was forced to get down at gunpoint as teachers responded to the situation by deferring their authority to the police. In my own recent research in collaboration with Associate Professor Kat Allinghouse, our study of Lutheran education programs for Aboriginal women in the 1960s has confirmed the significant personal costs associated with the boarding school experience offered up to Aboriginal children from remote Australia. Current Closing the Gap data suggests that formal education is continuing to fail Indigenous learners. The headline numbers tell us that the targets are not being met, that Indigenous people continue to be less than full and active participants in formal education is a major problem for Australia and for the future of Australian education. The continued absence of Indigenous people in Australia's formal education system makes it more difficult for non-Indigenous Australians to get to know who we are. In my own experience of formal education, there was little content about Aboriginal people, culture, history, philosophies, and so on available at my school. My Aboriginal family was not reflected in the curriculum. I have already touched on why this was a problem to me, and why it remains a problem to many Aboriginal people who experience invisibility within formal education. However, the silences that continue to exist within the curricula of Australia's formal education systems about Indigenous people and their place in the Australian past, present and future is also a problem for non-Indigenous Australia, as they remain largely ignorant about their own country and the antiquity of human occupation on this continent. A continent we all now call home. As someone who has taught Indigenous studies at tertiary level for the past 23 years or more, that's why I've got no hair left, I find it deeply troubling and incomprehensible that first-year undergraduate students continue to come to the field with very little or no pre-existing knowledge, insight or understanding of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders. Tertiary level Indigenous studies programs like the one I direct in the School of Culture and Communications in the Faculty of Arts continue to be required to overcome 13 years of primary and secondary school failings to teach young Australians about Indigenous peoples, cultures and histories. Making up for such failings during a 13-week semester of study is a difficult, if not impossible, task. As a professor of Indigenous studies, I remain deeply concerned and frustrated by the lack of apparent progress Australian primary and secondary school systems are making on this front. Undergraduate learners who come to Indigenous studies with no prior knowledge or experience of the field often become upset and traumatised by the materials presented to them in our subjects. Too many times I have been confronted by students upset that I'm changing history. Too often students continue to complain about the lack of information provided them at primary and secondary levels of education about Indigenous Australia. Many continue to ask the same question asked by Henry Reynolds: why weren't we told? And while I believe Indigenous studies is a worthy field of studies critical to the humanities and social sciences in an Australian-based university, introducing learnings about Indigenous Australia at tertiary level is, in my view, much too little, too late. Indigenous studies programs within Australian universities reach only a small proportion of undergraduate students. At this university, for example, around 9,000 students engage with Indigenous studies or knowledges through 174 subjects. And that's really high, I think. We're probably at the top of the pile as far as these things go. But that's 9,000 out of a total student body of around 54,000. It's progress, but it clearly demonstrates the point about too little, too late. No one's fallen asleep yet, so that's a really good sign. And I'm thankful there's no football on tonight. So you're all here. In my view, the invisibility and uncomfortableness that Indigenous people continue to experience in Australia's formal systems of education, and the lack of knowledge and unknowing non-Indigenous learners continue to experience in respect to knowing Indigenous Australia, exists as two sides of the same problem. These are problems that have solutions, as educational theorists and practitioners have been working on them since at least the 1970s. In the 1980s, H.C. Coombs, Nugget Coombs, wrote an important book called Aboriginal Autonomy, in which he critiqued the failings of Australia's formal education systems. in respect of Indigenous peoples. Coombs rightly suggested that if formal education was to engage Indigenous peoples in ways that led to successful outcomes, then the curriculum needed to reflect their interests and agendas and sense of personal and collective identity. In other words, Coombs suggested we listen to the voice of Indigenous Australia and develop an education offer that they wanted and needed, instead of persisting with failure based on endless attempts to sell them something they did not want or need. In other words, a successful formal education system needed to reflect Indigenous identity and be inclusive of Indigenous cultural concepts and traditions as a starting point to school-based learning. The two-way education models that emerged in Arnhem Land and other parts of the Northern Territory during the 1970s, as described by educationalists Stephen Harris and Kevin Keefe, provide an example of how Australian curriculum can incorporate Indigenous knowledges into primary and secondary levels of education. Although these models emphasised the absolute differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous worldviews and advocate a school day but built upon a split curricula where the Indigenous and non-Indigenous learnings operate in separate domains, which in my view make them somewhat problematic, they do provide clues about how to better engage Indigenous learners with formal education and how to better inform non-Indigenous Australians about Indigenous Australia that they largely remain ignorant of. At the present time, two-way education models are considered unfashionable and have not received the attention and interest from Australian government, schools, and education theorists that they rightly deserve. Indeed, in the Northern Territory, where these models originated, there has been a move back to the 1950s, and schools that are exclusive of local Indigenous knowledges and practices in their curricula and teaching and learning practices. And the research by my past PhD student, Al Fricker, demonstrates that at Papunya. The problematic nature of formal education in respect to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledges is also an issue that my esteemed colleague, Professor Marcia Langton, has been aware of for decades. I think it is fair to say that her thinking on the problem of formal education has been influenced by the two-way education models briefly described above. One important project she has initiated in recent years is the Indigenous Knowledge Resources for Australian School Curricula project. This project is a University of Melbourne initiative which aims to empower all teachers to integrate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures in their teaching, using these curriculum resources that incorporate Indigenous knowledges. This project is a partnership between the Indigenous Studies Unit in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry Health Sciences, MGSE, and the Indigenous Knowledges Institute. It involves a number of senior colleagues working together across the university's Indigenous activities to resource Australian teachers so that Indigenous knowledges become a normal part of every school teacher's daily work and not an optional add-on, as is overwhelmingly the case today. Still too often today, Indigenous knowledges that have informed human understandings and actions on this continent for the past 65,000 years are treated as exotic, foreign, and worse still, as curious barbecue entertainments to be rolled out annually when local Indigenous elders visit the school community for Reconciliation Week or NAIDOC Week activities. I hope that's not what is happening tonight. The existence of two-way education models, their documentation in the scholarly writings of Harris, Keefe and others, and the current work of Langton, Associate Professor Melita Hogarth in this faculty and others at this university suggests that the lack of positive change in Australian formal education does not rest exclusively with education systems and those who work in them, but with the lack of political will at the highest levels of Australian government. This lack of political will brings me back to the upcoming referendum and the concerns of Davis that non-Indigenous people do not know Indigenous Australia. That such a situation persists in 2023 is unfortunate given previous commitments Australian government has made to harness formal education systems to advance the cause of national reconciliation. Indeed, it is worth remembering that the failure of the Hawke government to enact a treaty-making process in the 1980s led us to the national reconciliation agenda of the 1990s and a discursive framework for understanding Indigenous settler relationships that remains influential to the present day, in part due to Reconciliation Australia and their program of Reconciliation Action Plans, or RAPs, in corporate Australia. The National Reconciliation Agenda set in place during the Hawke-Keating era was in many respects designed to educate the Australian population about Indigenous people to the extent that a better informed electorate would be equipped to engage in a mature national conversation about treaties between Australian government and Indigenous peoples. In the context of the realpolitik of the time, after Hawke announced that there would be a treaty process at the 1988 Barunga Festival, he was confronted with an immediate and impactful backlash from the resources sector, particularly in Western Australia, that threatened his prospects for re-election. Reconciliation, and I'm being sceptical here, represented an astute political sidestep that was designed to buy Prime Minister Hawke time with those pushing for and against his commitment for treaty. Education stood at the very centre of the stated aims of the Hawke agenda of national reconciliation. As such, a key intention of national reconciliation was to educate the Australian populace about the history, cultures and contributions Indigenous Australia had contributed to the nation. Given that I am here tonight speaking about the Voice referendum, expressing my personal doubts about its probable success, it is fair to say that the educative objectives of national reconciliation, a Commonwealth initiative that arguably defined Indigenous policy for 20 years from 1990, were largely ineffective. This failure of Commonwealth policy rests in part with the fact that constitutional responsibility for formal education rests with state and territory government. In part, it rests on the over-reliance of volunteerism that much of the educative programming that sought to underpin national reconciliation came to rest upon. The aspirations held for the role that formal education might play in progressing national reconciliation to an informed place where treaty-making processes might be possible, and the ultimate failure of these to be achieved are, for me at least, best summed up in the documentary film called Whiteys Like Us. Made in 1998, the synopsis provided by Ronin Films reads, "What goes on in a bland high school classroom at Manly Community College for 2 hours on Wednesday nights represents a fascinating microcosm of how white Australians are dealing or not dealing with the reconciliation process and the country's Indigenous past and present. All over Australia, groups of people are coming together to participate in 8-week reconciliation study circles. These circles are initiated by the Reconciliation Council of 1991 with the aim of improving relations between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other Australians. This documentary focuses on one such study circle through its 8 sessions and examines the impact the reconciliation process has on the participants' lives. The machinations of this group and the individual responses to it provide a glimpse of how Australians have reached the difficult, critical and complex nexus of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations, and how ordinary non-Indigenous Australians grapple personally with the issues this evoked by the process. This film demonstrates the extent of the knowledge and understanding gap that existed between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in the late 1990s. It also underlined the extent to which Australia's formal system of education had failed to educate all Australians about the formal political events that had shaped our collective history and the enduring impact this history continued to exert on contemporary race relations between settler and native. While it is several years since I last viewed this documentary, several of the key characters remain unforgettable. The former mission worker who maintains 1950s-style assimilation policy remains the only solution. The entitled white man in his 30s who believes all Australians have the same opportunities from birth that he enjoyed living on Sydney's wealthy North Shore. And the weekly classroom discussions that disintegrate into what has more in common, I think, with branch meetings of Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party than learning circles in support of national reconciliation. One scene where the group is visited by a local Aboriginal ranger in preparation for a weekend site tour is particularly telling. As the only Aboriginal person this study group interacts with, he is expected to know everything and provide all the solutions to the problem of reconciliation. As his visit to the study circle ends, he sighs heavily, exhausted by the expectation that he overcome in one short evening the collective ignorance the group has built up over decades. If whiteys like us told us anything, it was that after years of national reconciliation, non-Indigenous people continued to not know Indigenous Australia. Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders continued to be strangers to them, aliens in their own storied places. As we face the Voice referendum, I am concerned that the same situation documented in 1998 continues to exist in 2023. If the stories of then and now tell us anything, it is that we cannot simply sit back and think Australian governments alone will make the systematic changes that are required to improve the lot of the most marginal and disadvantaged in our society. A survey of Indigenous political struggles suggests that formal education has been both help and hindrance to the cause of Indigenous rights and recognition. Where it has been a help, it has largely been the outcome of individual school teachers and lecturers choosing to go above and beyond to support Indigenous learners achieve success and/or address the history of settler-native race relations by inserting Indigenous knowledges and historical perspectives of British colonialism in Australia into their lesson plans and the like. Where it has failed systematically, as the rhetoric of teaching Indigenous knowledges to all Australians who attend school has failed to turn into substantive action, as the resources to build capacity and capability have not been forthcoming, or debates about the impending collapse of Western civilisation that will occur if Indigenous studies components are added to HASS subjects in secondary schools indefinitely stall any real and systematic action. I didn't know we were so powerful. There you go. The hindrance of formal education to give Aboriginal people voice through persistent and ongoing systematic failure at the level of Australian government means that places like the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and the commitment of deans who oversee and direct their strategic and daily operations become even more important. This faculty is doing much to ensure the shortcomings of Australia's formal education systems are addressed, but more could be done and needs to be done. We cannot rely on the hard work of a few Indigenous academics to carry the change agenda alone. As I conclude this lecture, I encourage non-Indigenous colleagues who work in this faculty to do more to ensure formal education works as it should, to ensure the next generation of Australians know Indigenous Australia in ways that they should know the First Peoples of this continent. While the Voice referendum may well fail, due in large part to the failure of Australian formal education to produce an informed electorate, I continue to have faith that regardless of the outcome, the way we do formal education in Australia can change if enough teachers and educators, parents and students commit to making that change happen. If we agree that education and learning should be based in truth, then the rationale for why such change is required is self-evident. That self-evidence is driving the University of Melbourne Truth-Telling Project. This initiative will enable the university community to better know and understand its own institutional history of relationships, the good, the bad, the ugly, with Indigenous Australia. I think we will all be enriched by it and be better equipped to work together united in the task to build a better Australia for our children, grandchildren and beyond. So starting from a simple act of recognition to evoke Prime Minister Keating, based in truth, please continue to support the curriculum work of Professor Langton and Associate Professor Hogarth, as well as the work of your colleague, Dr. Sarah French, in coordinating the professional and graduate certificate programs in Indigenous research methods. This work, properly supported and resourced in this faculty, can make a real difference in making formal education a help and not a hindrance to Indigenous people's ability to have a voice. Thank you for listening. Good night, go well, and vote well. Thank you.
If you feel comfortable, you can stand next to me, or if you
Okay.
prefer to sit down.
I'll sit down.
Okay. Professor Judd, what an honour to be here tonight. On behalf of the MGSE, soon to be Faculty of Education, I'd like to express my deepest appreciation and gratitude to you You've challenged us to critically examine the role of formal education in empowering Indigenous voices and shaping the future of Indigenous communities. Your insights have enriched our journey of understanding the imperative of anti-colonial approaches to curriculum, endemic racism and our role in rejecting this perpetuation. I do not think you need any formal understanding of education or best practices of teaching and learning to know what is just. As you have personally experienced, our education system continues to fail our First Nations children. Education is not about shaming or invisibility, but rather an opportunity to give life, give hope and freedom to dream large. The picture that you have so generously shared with us is one that many of us might see ourselves in. As students, accepting what was taught to us, or perhaps as teachers perpetuating those racist stereotypes. Your story of that meaningful connection and inspiration from Mr. Bradbury or Dr. Newton highlight the power of an individual and the power of education. This is how it should be. I'm sure that your words resonate deeply with all of us present here tonight, and we are grateful for the profound insights that you have shared. The imperative for each of us is to commit to carrying the lessons and inspirations we have gained from this evening's event into our lives and work as we continue to champion the cause of Indigenous reconciliation and voice. This is a collective journey of transformation, recognising that the responsibility rests on all of our shoulders to foster a society that recognises, respects and uplifts the voices and rights of Indigenous peoples. We have a small token of our appreciation I'd like to present to you. And if we can all